Welcome to the podcast. I'm Lorraine Roberts and I'm a holistic counsellor and divorce recovery specialist based in Melbourne, Australia. And I work specifically with women 50 plus who are navigating divorce, separation, or the aftermath of a coercive control or narcissistic relationship. And today our podcast is titled Coercive Control in Family Law: What You're Really Seeing in Your Clients. So today I really want to talk to you about something that is quietly sitting underneath many of the cases that family lawyers are working with today, but often it isn't named, and it's called coercive control. And more importantly, I want to talk about how it shows up in your clients, because what I see time and time again is that a woman walks into a solicitor's office. She's finally left, or she's trying to leave, or maybe she left a while ago, and maybe she's on her third family lawyer, and you have to pick up the pieces from what others have done before you. And on the surface, it looks like progress. But when you sit with her, she doesn't look clear, she doesn't look confident, and she doesn't look like someone who is ready to move forward in a clean, logical way. Instead, she looks confused, overwhelmed, and uncertain. She might struggle to answer direct questions. She might change her mind mid-conversation. She might agree to something and then come back the next day and want to undo it. Or she might just make rash decisions that just aren't logical. She might delay responding, she might avoid emails or become emotional at what seems like the wrong moment. And from a professional point of view, that can be incredibly frustrating because you're there to do a job and she isn't helping. And you're there to move things forward. You're working within timelines, processes, different parameters, and expectations. And instead, you've got a client who can't seem to land on a decision. She needs constant reassurance and who doesn't seem settled, even after you've explained everything very clearly. And this is the point where something really important often happens. She gets labelled. She's labelled difficult, emotional, indecisive. She's labelled as hard to work with. But what if the behaviour isn't the problem? What if it's actually the evidence of something much, much deeper? Because when you understand coercive control, everything you're seeing starts to make sense. The indecision isn't indecision. The inconsistency isn't carelessness. The emotional reactions aren't overreactions. They are the result of long-term psychological conditioning. And I know this not just from the work I do, but because I've lived it. I understand what it is to sit in that space where you don't trust your own thinking, where even simple decisions feel overwhelming, where your body reacts before your mind has time to catch up. And now I work with women, mostly over 50, who are leaving these kinds of relationships. Women who've spent years, sometimes decades, or their lifetime, in environments where their voice was slowly eroded and where their confidence was questioned and where the reality was rewritten for them. So by the time they sit in front of you, they're not just dealing with a legal process. They're trying to make sense of things and rebuild their sense of self. And if you don't understand that piece, nothing about their behaviour will ever make sense. Once you do, you start to see things differently. You stop asking, why can't she just decide? And you start asking, what has she been through that makes this so hard? And that shift alone changes everything, because it's not just about legal outcomes. It's about understanding the person sitting in front of you. So today I want to walk you through what cohesive control it really is, what it looks like in your client's eyes, and why they present the way they do, and what actually helps them move forward. Because when you understand this, your work becomes clearer, your clients become easier to support, and the entire process becomes more effective. So let's start with this. This is not a normal divorce. And I say this very clearly because if you treat this like a standard separation, you will feel frustrated and your clients will feel unsupported. In a typical separation, both parties may not agree, but there is usually some level of shared reality. There is some willingness at some point to resolve everything, to negotiate, to move forward. But in coercive control dynamics, this is not what is driving the situation. The goal is not resolution, the goal is control. And in many cases, it goes even further than that. It becomes about destroying the other person financially, professionally, socially. It can look like drained shared resources, withholding money, dragging out proceedings very unnecessarily, not because it makes sense legally, but because it creates pressure. It can look like attempts to damage credibility, questioning your client's mental health, rewriting history, and positioning them as unstable and unreliable. Sometimes very subtly, sometimes very strategically, and sometimes very convincingly too. It can show up socially as well, turning friends, family, or even community members against your clients, creating a narrative that your client is the problem. So by the time she gets to you, she's not just dealing with a separation, she's dealing with the dismantling of her own identity. And here's where this really matters to you because you are trying to work in a logical, structured system with timelines, processes, expected behaviours, but your client is not operating from a regulated, logical place. She's often in survival mode. At the same time, the other party may appear calm, rational, even cooperative on the surface, which can create a very confusing dynamic because the person causing the harm doesn't look like the problem. And the person who has experienced the harm doesn't always present clearly. So, what can happen to this? You find yourself thinking, why is this so hard? Why won't she just decide? Why does this keep going in circles? And at the same time, you may be dealing with the opposing party who is highly reactive behind the scenes, but controlling in formal settings, deliberately delaying or escalating at key moments, using the legal system itself as a tool of control. And this is where the understanding of coercive control becomes critical because without that lens, nothing about this dynamic makes sense. You might try to push for faster decisions. You might expect your client to just choose. You might assume both parties are engaging in the same way, but they're not. One is trying to move forward, the other is trying to maintain power or regain it, and sometimes to punish. And when that's the underlying driver, you will see endless back and forth, agreements that don't hold, last minute changes, unnecessary complications. Not because the case is complex, but because the dynamics are. And this is the part that changes everything. When you understand what is actually happening, you stop taking the behavior at face value. You stop seeing your client as difficult and you start recognizing she is trying to function after years of being conditioned not to trust herself. You also start to see the other parties differently, not just as someone who is being uncooperative, but as someone who may be using control, pressure, and perception as strategy. And when you see both sides clearly, you can respond more effectively. You can manage expectations better and you can support your client in a way that actually moves things forward because here's the truth. When cohesive control is present, you are not just managing a legal case, you are working within a psychological dynamic. And if that dynamic isn't understood, it will continue to play out inside the process. So let's look at what cohesive control actually is. And let's take a step back and really define what we're really talking about. Because cohesive control is often misunderstood. We tend to associate abuse with physical violence, bruises, injuries, and something that's visible. But coercive control doesn't look like that at all. In fact, many women will say, but he never hit me. And that becomes the benchmark they use to minimize what they actually experienced. Because coercive control is not about isolated incidents. This is a pattern. It really is a pattern. A system of behaviors designed to dominate, control, and destabilize the other person over time. And it often happens gradually. And that person experiences it, doesn't even realize what's happening at first. So it starts subtly. Comment here, a criticism there, questioning their decisions, correcting their version of events. And over time, that builds into something much bigger. Let me explain how and what that really looks like in real life. It looks like isolation. It's not always in an obvious way. Sometimes it's like, we don't need to see them. I'm not going there. They don't really care about you. Oh, they're a really bad influence on you. I don't want you spending time with them. So, contact with friends and family slowly reduces. They might start arguments and fights. So, you don't want to go back there. You're embarrassed. Whatever. So, support systems disappear and the person becomes more dependent on the relationship and the other person. It can look like financial control too. So, limited access to money, questioning everything they purchase, requiring justification for spending money, or controlling all financial decisions entirely. So, the person loses not just independence, but choice and financial stability. It can look like emotional manipulation too, telling them, you're too sensitive, you're overreacting. That never happened. Oh, you can never remember things. Why don't you? Etc., etc. This is where reality starts to shift because if you're constantly being told your experience is wrong, you begin to question your own thinking. And this is where gaslighting comes in. And over time, that erodes confidence in a very deep level. It can also look like control disguised as care. I'm just trying to help you. I know what's best for you. You wouldn't cope without me. And this is where it becomes confusing because it doesn't always feel abusive. Sometimes it feels protective and like love or supportive. But underneath that, there is a constant message that you can't trust yourself, but you can trust me and you need me. And that message, repeated over years, changes a person. Now, here's something really important to understand. Coercive control is not about anger. It's not about losing control. It's actually about maintaining control, which is why it can be very calculated, very subtle, and very consistent. The person using coercive control often knows exactly what they're doing. They may present really well externally. They're charming, they can be reasonable, even likable, which makes it even harder to identify because what's happening behind closed doors doesn't match what others see. Now, let's talk about the internal impact because this is the part that shows up in your office. Over time, the person experiencing this kind of control begins to lose their sense of self, their confidence, their ability to make decisions. They stop trusting their instincts. They second guess everything. They look outside themselves for validation and eventually they adapt. They become more agreeable, more cautious, more focused on avoiding conflict. They feel like they're walking on eggshells because that has been the safest way to survive. So when they leave the relationship or try to leave, they don't suddenly become clear and decisive. They carry all of the conditioning with them. And this is why you might see someone who knows something wasn't right but can't clearly explain it. And they're confused. They feel unsafe but can't point to a specific event where it wasn't safe. They will want to move forward but feel paralyzed when making decisions because coercive control doesn't just affect behavior, it reshapes your identity, the way you see yourself. Now, I want to add one more layer here because coercive control is also about power and perception. It's not just what happened in the relationship, it's how the narrative is managed outside of it. So the person using control may position themselves as the reasonable one, frame your client as unstable, subtly undermine her credibility. So when she speaks up, she already is on the back foot. And again, this creates confusion because from the outside, it may not be obvious who is telling the truth. But from the inside, your client has been living in a reality where her voice has been diminished for years. And this is why naming coercive control is so important. Because once it's named, the behavior starts to make sense. The patterns become visible, and your client can begin to separate who she is from what she has been conditioned to believe about herself. And for you, as a solicitor, this understanding gives context to everything you're seeing. It explains the confusion that she's feeling. It explains the hesitation, the inconsistency, and they're not as personality traits, but as the result of a long-term psychological pressure. Now, let's bring this into your world because this is the part where everything we've just been talking about becomes visible. Not in theory, but in the way your client sits in front of you, the way she speaks, the way she makes decisions, or the way she can't do any of that. Because coercive control doesn't stay in the relationship. It walks straight into your office with her. And if you don't know what you're looking at, it can be misread very quickly. So let me walk you through what you've been seeing. Not in isolated behaviours, but as in patterns that have been constant throughout her whole life. So there's 10 all up. The first one is difficulty making decisions. This is one of the biggest ones. You might ask a simple question, what would you like to do? And instead of a clear answer, you may get hesitation, silence, or I'm not sure. Even when the opinion is the options are straightforward, even when you've explained everything clearly to her and what can happen, is this starts to feel like resistance or avoidance, but it's not. This is what happens when someone who has been conditioned not to trust their own thinking, every decision feels risky. Because in the past, making the wrong decision had consequences for her. There was emotional backlash, there was withdrawal, there was punishment. So now her system is trying to keep her safe, not by deciding at all, or by delaying, or by looking to you to decide for her. Now, her behavior may also be that she changes her mind all the time. You finally get a decision. It feels like progress, and then she comes back. She wants to change it or undo it or revisit the conversation again. And this can feel like ongoing, and it's just going backwards. But again, this is not inconsistency for the sake of it. This is what it looks like when someone doesn't feel safe in their own choices. She may leave your office feeling certain, but then she sits with it, overthinks it, questions it, or gets triggered by someone or something from her ex. And suddenly that decision doesn't feel safe anymore. So she pulls back and changes her mind. She may also suffer from consistent reassurance seeking. So you can explain something clearly, you answer the question, you give professional advice, and she nods. And then she asks again in a slightly different way, or comes back the next day with the same concern. And you might think, I've already answered this. But what she's actually asking is not just about the information. She's asking, is it safe for me to trust this? Because her initial trust has been eroded. So she looks outside of herself to you repeatedly. Now, she also might find overwhelm with simple processes. Things that would normally be manageable, like she might feel too much, or there might be too much paperwork, emails, timelines, even reading communication from the other side. And you might see avoidance, delays, missed responses, not because she doesn't care, but because her nervous system is overloaded. What simply looks to you and feels is different. She feels threatened, especially if it involves interaction with her ex. She might be triggered by communication. An email comes in, a message, a legal letter, and suddenly everything shifts. She becomes emotional, panicked, reactive, or completely shut down. And from the other side, it can seem like an overreaction to a piece of communication, but that message doesn't land in isolation. It lands on top of years of history, of tone, language patterns. So what you're seeing is not just a response to the email, it's a response to everything that email represents. She might second guess everything. Even after decisions are made, even after advice is given, she questions it, revisits it, doubts it. You might hear, what if I'm wrong? What if this backfires? What if he reacts badly? And this loop over and over because she's been trained to anticipate negative outcomes, to expect backlash, to be punished. So her mind is constantly scanning for risks. She may agree and then panic. And this is a really important one. She may agree to something in the moment. It seems settled, and then later she panics. She wants to change it, feels like she's made a mistake. And again, this can look like instability. But often what's happening is this. In the moment, she defaults to agreement because that was the safest strategy in the relationship. Agree, keep the peace, avoid conflict. But once she's out of that moment, her real feelings come up and they don't match what she agrees to. So now she's torn. She may have awareness something is wrong but can't explain it. And this is one of the most misunderstood representations. She knows something wasn't right. She knows the relationship was harmful. But when you ask for specifics, she struggles. She might say, I can't explain it. It just didn't feel right. I felt like I was losing myself. I just felt like I had to walk on eggshells the whole time. And because there was no clear, concrete examples, her experience can be minimised or questioned. But coercive control is not always made up of obvious incidents. It's cumulative, subtle, layered, which makes it very hard to articulate. And she may also be looking for you for direction. And you may find that your client wants you to tell her what she wants, not just advice, but decide for her. And if you don't, she feels lost, she feels stuck because she hasn't yet rebuilt that internal decision making ability. So she leans on external authority. And in this space, that becomes you because she doesn't know what she wants. She also may shut down and withdraw because at times she may disengage, so not respond. She may miss appointments, delay moving things forward, And this can be interpreted as a lack of commitment, but often it's a sign of overwhelm, of fear, of emotional exhaustion, because this process is not just practical for her, it's deeply triggering. It's also learnt behaviour. So she's learnt that when things were going to go bad, she just shut down or withdrew, and that's how she managed through it. So when you look at all these 10 things all together, it can look like a client who is inconsistent, emotional, indecisive, hard to manage. But when you understand cohesive control, you see something very different. You see someone who has lost trust in herself, been conditioned to doubt her reality, learned to survive by staying small and careful, or just withdrawing altogether, and has been isolated, and is she's now asking to make things clear, confident decisions in a high pressure environment. And that's hard. It's a huge gap. And this is why recognizing these patterns matter, because when you see them for what they are, you stop reacting to the behavior and you start responding to the person underneath it. And that shifts. And that's when things begin to change. So, why do they present in this way? So, let's look at this and what's actually going on underneath all of this. Because once you understand that part, everything you've been seeing starts to make sense. And more importantly, it stops feeling personal, because it's not. It stops feeling frustrating. Yeah, probably is. And it starts to feel understandable, and you will get it. This is not personality, this is conditioning. And what you are seeing is not who your client is at all. It's who she has become to survive in the environment she was living in. Coercive control is not just something that happens to someone, it's something that's reshaped how they think, it's reshaped how they feel, and how they respond in every different situation. And over time, your client has been trained, often very subtly, how to behave and what's acceptable in her behaviour. Not through obvious instruction, but through consequences. If she spoke up, there may have been conflict, or they may have withdrawn. She might have been ignored for a week or two. There was punishment that may have been attached to this. And if she disagreed, there may have been criticism, dismissal, or escalation. So she learns to stay quiet, to agree to everything, and to avoid conflict. Not because she's weak, but because it keeps things stable. And over time, that becomes automatic. There's a loss of internal trust. One of the biggest impacts of coercive control is this, that she never trusts herself again. Not her thoughts, not her feelings, and not her decisions. Because for years those things were questioned, they were dismissed, or they were rewritten. So if you are constantly told that's not what happened, you're imagining things. You always get things wrong. Eventually, you stop relying on your own internal compass and you start looking outside yourself instead. So when she sits with you and asks you, and you ask her, what do you want? It's not a simple question, because the part of her that used to know that answer has been overridden for a long time. And now it is, well, what does everyone else want? What will make the peace? And how do I get out of this with less conflict? Her nervous system is in survival mode. And let's talk about the body, because this isn't this isn't psychological, it's physiological as well. When someone has lived in a controlling environment, their nervous system adapts. They become hyper aware, alert. They scan for threats, even when there is no immediate danger. So when something happens in your process, an email, a request, a decision point, Her body reacts first, before logic, before reasoning. And that's why you see panic, overwhelm, avoidance, shutdown. This is not a conscious choice. This is a survival response. And until that settles, clear thinking is very difficult. Fear of consequences is a huge driver. She is not just making decisions based on what is logical, she's making decisions based on what feels safe. And those are not always the same thing because in her past experience, decisions had consequences. If she chose something her partner didn't like, there may have been backlashes, conflict, emotional punishment. So now every decision carries a lever of fear, a level of fear. What will happen if I choose this? How will he react? Will this make things worse? Even if that reaction is no longer immediate, her system still expects it. So she hesitates, or she avoids, or she changes direction. Her identity is eroded. And over time, coercive control doesn't just affect behavior, it affects your identity. Your client may have spent years being told who she is or who she's not, what she's capable of or what she can't do, what she's worth or how worthless she is. And slowly she starts to think. She becomes less expressive. Sorry, she's shrinking, not thinking, she's shrinking because she becomes less expressive, less certain, less visible. So when she leaves, she doesn't suddenly step into confidence. She often feels lost, disconnected, unsure of who she is without the dynamic. So when you're asking her to make decisions about her future, she's doing that without a strong sense of self to guide her. And she probably has no clue. There's cognitive overload. And now add the legal process on top of that, all the information, the options, the timelines, the documents, the communication. For someone who is already overwhelmed internally, this becomes too much. So instead of processing it clearly, she may delay, avoid, shut down, or rely heavily on you. Not because she isn't capable, but because her capacity is reduced in that state. There's also trauma bonding and mixed emotions, and this is another piece that can be really confusing to other people. She may still feel connected to her ex, even if the relationship was harmful, even if she knows she needs to leave. And this can show up as doubt, guilt, or second guessing herself, or even moments of wanting to go back. And from the outside, that can seem really irrational, but inside the dynamic, there were often cycles, periods of tension, followed by relief or connection, and she felt loved. And that creates a strong emotional bond. So she's not just leaving a person, she's untangling a complex emotional attachment to the other person. So why logic alone doesn't work? And this is where a lot of frustration can come in. Because from your perspective, you are presenting clear logical options. This is the outcome. This is the process. This is the next step. But logic only works when someone feels safe and regulated. And if your client is in a heightened emotional state or feeling overwhelmed, logic doesn't land. It doesn't stick. It doesn't translate into action. So you may feel like you're repeating yourself, but the issue isn't the explanation, it's the state that she is in when she receives it. So when you put all this together, what you are seeing in the purse is, you know, Um, what you're seeing is a person who has been controlled and conditioned to doubt herself. She's operating from a dysregulated nervous system, is anticipating consequences, is rebuilding her identity, is overwhelmed by the whole process, and is being asked to think clearly, decide quickly, and move forward confidently. And that's a big ask. So, this is why understanding this matter so much is so important, because when you see the mechanism, you stop trying to fix the behavior and you start supporting the person. And when the person feels safer, clearer, more grounded, that's when the behavior starts to shift. So, what don't you do? This next part's really important because most of what I'm saying comes from good intentions. Solicitors want to help. They want, and you want clarity. You want efficiency and progress. But when coercive control is part of the dynamic, some of the usual approaches can usually make things harder. Not because they're wrong, but because they don't match what your client needs in the moment. So don't rush decisions. There is often pressure in legal processes to move quickly, timelines, deadlines, responses, and that makes sense. But when your client is already overwhelmed, rushing decisions doesn't create clarity. It creates more anxiety and she feels pushed. She's more likely to shut down, agree just to get through the moment, or make a decision she later pulls back from. And when you're when you're back, then you're back where you started from. It might feel slower to give her space, but in reality, it often leads to more stable decisions. So don't expect immediate clarity. You may be used to asking direct questions and getting direct answers, but in this situation, clarity is something that needs to be rebuilt, not demanded. So when you ask, what do you want to do? And she doesn't know, that's not avoidance. That's actually being honest. If you expect immediate certainty, you may unintentionally create pressure, and pressure leads to confusion, not clarity. So don't label your client. This is one of the biggest ones, even if it's only in your own mind. So if you think she's difficult, she's emotional, and she's indecisive, because once that label is there, it shapes how you respond to her. And you may become shorter, more directive, less patient, and your client will feel that, even if nothing is said directly. And when she feels judged or misunderstood, she withdraws even further and goes within herself. So instead of asking, why is she like this? Shift it to, what has she been through that makes this make sense? So don't overload her with information. If you're working in a complex system, there is a lot to explain, a lot to consider. But when someone is already overwhelmed, too much information doesn't help. It just shuts things down. And you might see blank looks, nodding without real understanding or complex or complete disengagement because her system can't process it all at once. So instead of giving everything, give what is needed for the next step and keep it simple, clear, and manageable. Also, don't dismiss emotional responses, and because there can be a tendency to separate emotion from process, to stay focused on fact, outcomes, what needs to happen next. But if your client becomes emotional, that's not a distraction, that's information. It tells you that she is overwhelmed, triggered, or feeling unsafe. If that is ignored, she won't suddenly regulate and continue. She will either escalate emotionally or shut down completely. Acknowledging emotion doesn't slow things down. It often helps to move things forward. Also, you can't expect normal behavior. This is not a standard client presentation. So, expecting standard responses will lead to frustration. You may expect clear communication, consistent decisions, logical progression, but coercive control disrupts all of that. So when those expectations aren't met, it's not because your client is unwilling, it's because she is not yet able to. And that's an important distinction. Also, don't take the other party at face value. This is a subtle but critical point. Often, because the other party presents very well and they may appear calm, organised, reasonable, even charismatic, especially in formal situations, while your client appears emotional, uncertain, inconsistent. And if you don't understand coercive control, it can look like the roles are reversed. But what you're seeing externally is not always an accurate reflection of what has been happening. So it's important to stay aware of that dynamic and not rely solely on presentation. Also, don't push logic over safety. This is where a lot of disconnection can happen. You're working from logical processes, outcomes, and your client is responding to safety or lack of it. She might be scared. So if you keep pushing logic without addressing the underlying state, it won't land. You may explain something perfectly, but if she doesn't feel safe, you won't be able to act on it. Safety comes first. Clarity comes after. So when you look at all of this, what doesn't help is rushing, labeling, overloading, dismissing, and expecting normal behaviour. And again, none of this comes from a bad place. It comes from trying to do your job well. But when you're working with someone who has experienced coercive control, the approach needs to shift slightly from let's move this forward quickly to let's move this forward in a way that actually works for my client. Because when the approach matches the person, everything starts to flow more easily. So now let's talk about what actually helps. So you know what does help, because when you understand this dynamic, you don't need to completely change how you work. You just need to adjust how you support this type of client. And often, small shifts make a very big difference. So keep things simple and clear. And when someone is overwhelmed, clarity becomes everything. Not more information, not more options, just clear, simple directions. Instead of giving multiple pathways, focus on the next step, not the whole process. You might say, right now, we just need to decide this one thing. Or let's focus on this part first. We don't need to solve everything today. This reduces pressure. And when pressure reduces, thinking improves. So break decisions into small steps. Big decisions feel unsafe. They carry too much weight. So the more you can break things down, the more manageable it becomes. Instead of what do you want to do overall, let's look at option A and option B, and let's explore how each one feels. Or even what feels like the safest next step for you right now. You're not forcing clarity, you're helping her build it. So give time without disengaging, because time's important, but so is structure. If you give too much space, you may avoid completely. If you give too little, she may feel pressured. So that's about balance. You can say, take a couple of days to sit with this and we'll revisit this on Thursday. That gives her permission to pause, a clear time frame and sense of containment, which helps her stay engaged. You also want to normalize her experience. One of the most powerful things you can do is help her feel that what she's experiencing makes sense, because many women in this situation feel confused, embarrassed, and ashamed. They often feel, why can't I just deal with this? So when you say things like, what your experience is actually very common after this type of relationship, you remove the layer of self-judgment. And when that drops, she can think more clearly. Also, creating a sense of safety in the process. because safety is not just physical, it's emotional, it's relational. It's how she feels in the interaction with you. Consistency helps. Calm communication helps. Predictability helps. Even small things like explaining what will happen next, letting her know what to expect, following through on what you say, all of this builds trust. And when trust builds, she begins to settle. So check for understanding, not just agreement. This is a subtle shift, but a very important one, because she may say yes without fully processing or without actually feeling comfortable. So instead of just moving forward, pause and check. You might ask, how does that make you feel? Does it sit okay? Or do you have any concerns? This gives her permission to speak instead of defaulting to agreement. You might also want to reconnect, help her reconnect with her own voice. And over time, your clients need to rebuild their ability to make decisions. So instead of stepping in and deciding for her, gently guide her back to herself. And you might say something like, what's your instinct here? What option feels more right for you? Even if she struggles at first, you are helping her rebuild that internal connection, and that is what will support her long term. Stay steady when she can't. There will be moments when she feels overwhelmed, emotional, unsure. In those moments, your steadiness matters, not reacting, not becoming frustrated, just staying calm, grounded, and clear, because she will often take her cue from you. If you remain steady, she begins to settle more quickly. So, understanding that process may not look linear. This is important because progress here doesn't always look like forward movement. It can look like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, a decision made, then revisited, engagement, then withdrawal. That doesn't mean things aren't working. It means she is progressing and processing and rebuilding. So patience here actually creates momentum. Know when extra support is needed, and there are times where legal support alone is not enough. And this is where having the right external support makes a significant difference. When your client is emotionally supported, she regulates faster, she communicates more clearly, and she makes decisions more confidently, which supports your process as well. Because this isn't just a legal journey for her, this is a psychological one. So, what actually helps is not complicated. It's simplicity, clarity, patience, consistency, and understanding. It's meeting your client where she is, not where you expect her to be. And when you do that, something shifts. She feels safer. She feels understood. She starts to think more clearly. And that's when decisions become easier, communication improves, and the process begins to move forward in a much more stable way. So, what we've talked about today is not just a different type of client, it's a completely different dynamic, because when coercive control is present, you are not just working with a legal situation, you are working with an aftermath of long-term psychological conditioning. You're working with a woman who has spent years being shaped by someone else's control. Years of questioning herself, second guessing her reality, adapting her behaviour to stay safe. So when she sits in front of you, she's not trying to navigate a legal process, she's trying to find her footing again. And that takes time. It takes understanding, and it takes the right kind of support, because when that support is there, everything changes. She starts to feel safe. She starts to trust herself again. She communicates more clearly and makes decisions with more certainty. And suddenly the process that once felt stuck starts to move. Not because you pushed harder, but because she is more able to engage. And that makes your job easier, your communication clearer, and your outcome stronger. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from today, it's this. If your client seems difficult, pause and ask yourself, what might she have experienced that makes her make this sense? Because that question alone will change how you see her and how you support her. And that shift is where real progress begins. If this resonates with what you're seeing in your clients, I'd love to support you further. I've created resources specifically for professionals working with women leaving coercive, controlling relationships. And I also work directly with clients alongside the legal process, helping them regulate, rebuild confidence, and make clear decisions so that they can show up in your process more grounded, more certain, and easy to work with. Because when we support both sides of this journey, legal and emotional, that's when we get the best outcomes for you and for your clients. So remember, your future is created by what you do today, and sometimes the smallest shifts in understanding creates the biggest change in results. I'm Lorraine Roberts.